In the previous video, I demonstrated the initial configuration that is required in vSphere in order to install and configure the TKO reference architecture. In this video, we are now going to demonstrate the initial configuration that is required in NSX-T in order to install and configure the TKO reference architecture. So the first thing I'm going to do is log into VMware NSX-T. And if we navigate to networking, tier 0 gateways, we can see a T0 gateway is already created, and we demonstrated this in a previous video. So we are now going to create a tier 1 gateway which will connect to this tier 0 gateway. So we're going to navigate to tier 1 gateways and add tier 1 gateway. So we need to enter a name for this. I am going to follow the naming convention that we used for the T0 gateway. So I'm going to call this NSX-T 01-T1-TR. And then we have the option of selecting a tier 0 gateway. So we are going to select the tier 0 gateway, which exists in this environment. And then we're going to select the edge cluster, which is created in NSX-T. So we only have one. I'm going to select that one. Although the edge cluster is an optional configuration, it is required for the tier 1 gateway to host stateful services such as NAT, load balancing, or firewalling. We're going to leave the default failover option of non-preemptive. And then we're going to select enable standby relocation. And we're going to drop down the route advertisement option and select all DNS forwarder routes, all connected segments and service ports. So our created segments are routed back to the T1 and then to the T0. We're going to select all IPsec local endpoints, all load balancer VIP routes, and all load balancer SNAT IP routes. Once we've set these configuration options, we're going to click on Save. So although the initial configuration is performed, there's some additional configuration which we now need to do once it's created. So we are going to select Yes to continue configuring the tier 1 gateway. And we are going to set the DHCP configuration on this gateway. So we're going to click that. Type, we're going to choose DHCP server. And then for the DHCP server profile, we're going to select the one which is already pre-created in the environment. And you'll see that profile is configured with a lease time and a server address. We're then going to click Save. And save again, and we're now going to close the editing of the tier 1 gateway. So we've performed all the configurations that is required, and you'll see the status is success. You'll also see linked segments is 0, and that's because we haven't created any segments yet. We're going to create those now, and then we'll link them to this tier 1 gateway, and this should show the number of segments we've got connected. So NSX-T provides the option to add two kinds of segments, an overlay backed segment and a VLAN backed segment. The segments are created as part of a transport zone, and there are two types of transport zones which match this. So there's a VLAN transport zone and overlay transport zone. A segment created in a VLAN transport zone is a VLAN backed segment, and a segment created in an overlay transport zone is an overlay backed segment. In this scenario, we are only going to be creating overlay backed segments, and we are going to follow the samples outlined in the reference architecture, which you will now see in the top right hand corner. So if we click Add segment, we have two required configuration options. We've got the segment name and the connected gateway. So as mentioned before, the segment name, we're going to follow the samples provided in the TKO reference architecture. So if we go top to bottom, the first segment we're going to create is the ALB management logical segment. And this is the segment that's going to have the NSX ALB VMs connected to it. So the controller and the service engines. For connected gateway, we're going to choose the tier 1 gateway, which we created earlier. For transport zone, we're going to select the NSX-T01 overlay transport zone. So this is the current transport zone which has the transport node members connected to it. So we're now going to enter the sample subnets which are shown above. These two configuration options at the moment look very similar, but if we expand it a little, you'll see there's a gateway CIDR for IPv4 and one for IPv6. We're going to use the IPv4 one. So in this case, it's going to be 172.19.71.1/27. And for this segment, we're not going to set any DHCP config because it's not required. The addresses are actually going to be managed from within NSX ALB. So that's all the configuration we actually need to do. And then we can click Save. So we don't want to perform any additional configuration on this segment. So we're going to say no. And we're going to move on to creating the next logical segment, which is the one for the cluster VIP network. So this network is essentially going to have VIPs connected to it for the services that are provided in our TKG clusters. So this will be anything of service type load balancer. So it's going to provide a load balance service for our highly available TKG control plane nodes, and any service which is created with type load balancer in Kubernetes is going to have a VIP assigned to it that we can access that service on. So for the segment name, we're going to call it TKG-cluster-VIP. Connected gateway, again, we're going to choose the tier 1 gateway. Transport zone, we're going to choose the same NSX-T01-overlay transport zone. And the gateway CIDR is going to be 172.19.75.1/26. We're not going to perform any additional configuration on this, so we'll click Save, and no. Again, that segment doesn't require any DHCP configuration because the IPs are controlled via NSX ALB. So now we're going to move on to creating the TKG management shared service and workload segments. These will require DHCP, so that is a requirement. And so for these segments, the major difference you'll see is that we are going to set the DHCP config for these segments. So the first one we're going to create is TKG-management-logical segment. Connected gateway, again, is going to be the tier 1 gateway we created earlier, and transport zone is NSX-T01-overlay. The gateway CIDR we're going to set to 172.19.72.1/27. So we are now going to set the DHCP config for this segment. And to do that, we're going to click Set DHCP Config. You'll see the DHCP type by default is set to Gateway DHCP Server. And we're going to leave it as that. Essentially, what that means is that DHCP is going to be provided as a service on the tier 1 gateway we created. And you can see the DHCP profile that we used. Moving on to edit any of the DHCP configurations and define ranges, we need to set the DHCP config toggle to enabled. And once we've done that, we can now set the DHCP ranges, which you will see in the top right of the screen. So the DHCP range for the TKG management logical segment is 172.19.72.2 to 172.19.72.30. Lease time we're going to leave as default. So for the DNS configuration, we're going to use a public DNS server. So in this case, we're going to use Google's. So the IP address for that is 8.8.8.8. And then we also need to set some additional DHCP options. So if we click on the options tab here, we'll see select DHCP option. The ones we want to add are generic options. And we're going to add a value for NTP servers. So in this case, I'm going to use a public NTP server again. You can't enter hostname values for this. So we're going to need to enter an IP address. The NTP service I'm going to use is pool.ntp.org, which I have just pinged to get the IP address, and that's the IP address it's given me. So I'm going to use that and click add. And then the second option we're going to add here is a domain search. And for this, I'm going to add the domain for my environment. So those are the two generic options that are required. Once those are added, I'm going to click apply and then save. And then our logical segment will be saved. We don't want to perform any additional configuration on this, so I'm going to click no. So we have two more segments to create now. And the next one we're going to create is the shared services logical segment. So this one, the name's going to be TKG SS-LS. Connected gateway is going to be the tier 1. Transport zone is going to be the same as before. Gateway CIDR is going to be 172.19.73.1/27. So again, we're going to set the DHCP config on this segment. So we're going to enable DHCP config. We're going to enter the DHCP range. So in this case, it'll be 172.19.73.2 to 172.19.73.30. And the DNS server, we're going to add exactly the same one, 8.8.8.8. And we're going to enter the same generic options. So NTP servers, we're going to enter the IP address for pool.ntp.org. And we're going to add domain search with the DNS suffix of our environment. Once that's done, I'm going to click apply and save. We don't want to perform any extra configuration, so I'm going to click no, and you'll see our logical segment created here. So we're almost there, only one more segment to create. So last segment we're creating is for the TKG workload virtual machines. So this one we're going to call TKG-workload-logical segment. Connected gateway, we're going to select the T1 transport zone, same as before. So the gateway is going to be 172.19.77.1/24. Now, as I mentioned in my previous video, it's most likely that you will create multiple logical segments for your workload clusters in order to segregate the network traffic, as well as not running out of IP address space when you start to create a large number of workload clusters. But in this case, we're just going to create a single logical segment. So just like before, we're going to set the DHCP config. So in this case, the DHCP range is going to be 172.19.77.2 to 172.19.77.251. DNS server, we're going to set to the same as before, so 8.8.8.8. And then we're going to set the same generic options. So NTP server, we are going to set to the IP of pool.ntp.org, and we're going to set the domain search to the DNS suffix for my environment. So once those two are configured, we're going to click apply and save. We don't want to configure any additional options. So you will now see all 5 of the segments which we created. And if you navigate to the tier 1 gateways, you will now see that we have 5 linked segments. So those are the 5 segments we created, and they are all linked to the T1 gateway that we created. We can also go to the network topology, and this will give us a visualization of the topology that's deployed in NSX-T, and you will see it's showing our segments that we've just created here, and it will also show the data flow. So you can see the data flows going from the segment to the tier 1 gateway and up through the tier 0 gateway to the physical network. So that concludes all the initial configuration that's required in NSX-T, and it also concludes this video. Thank you for watching.